All right, so today's topic is networks in time of war and natural disasters. So this is actually something that I didn't want to talk about in the first place. So in this network security course, last year when I was teaching, there was a war between Ukraine and Russia. So our friends, our students were in shelters when we were giving the lecture. So I give a small lecture about how the networks work in time of war. So this year I was hoping that the war would end, but it didn't. So it still continues. But more importantly, now we are facing, big earthquakes happened in the 6th of February 2023 in Kahramanmaraş. So I wanted to briefly mention how network or communications can continue during these times of disasters or wars. So this is one of the reasons actually we are having a distant education right now due to the earthquake. So I think it was a wrong call, by the way, if the higher education of Turkey left the decision to universities. I think Middle East Technical University would prefer the hybrid education. So this way we could be both in classroom, but also people who cannot come to classroom could join via Zoom. But yeah, this is how the rules are. All right, so let's start. So this is about, we are talking about network security. So we are actually talking about devices or people communicating to each other. So the classic cryptographic people, Alice and Bob, wants to communicate. And there is a malicious person, generally referred to as Eve, wants to eavesdrop. So we are assuming that there is a communication channel between these people. So in the past, this was, telegraph or landlines for phones. But nowadays we have fiber optic cables, Ethernet cables, but we also have wireless communication like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or GSM communication. But regardless of which communication channel you are using, we assume that it is unsecured because somebody can tap in and listen to what you're talking. So in the wired case, you have to find the physical access to the communication channel. But in the case of wireless, it is even easier because if you have a proper antenna, you can record the communication. If you have a very strong antenna, you can even modify like jammers and so on. So here we assume that Eve can always listen to this communication channel. And so this is a passive attack. So she only listens. But if she modifies or deletes or adds something or changes the data during transmission, so we say that it is a modification. So in order to avoid listening, what cryptography provides is encryption. So we have confidentiality. Regardless of the channel security, we are sure that we communicate in a secure way using ciphers. But also to avoid modification, we have again cryptographic solutions like hash functions or message authentication codes or authenticated encryption, which proves that when the person receives the message, knows that it hasn't been altered. Okay, so that was the whole communication. But the third thing is that we, this is a CIA threat of the security, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Here, the problem arises in the case of availability, right? Because in the case of war or natural disasters, we lose this communication channel, so it is not available. So the question is, what can you do in that case? So strange thing happened during the war between Ukraine and Russia. We started to see that Russian soldiers using radio. So I have some screenshots probably from Twitter and so on that I took from last year at the beginning of the war. So for the first time in a modern conflict, the regular forces of Russia are communicating without digital mode, making them fully audible by everyone. Because if you switch to analog radio, then this means that you are not encrypting anything here. So but people can listen, record your communication. And actually, we have a lot of recorded communication of Russian soldiers this way. because a lot of people have, antenna, and they listen to radio communication all the time throughout the world. So again, from last year, almost no one can get a hold of central command. It is not even a matter of jamming. There is no long-range commo equipment or relays that went with the troops there. So this was the problem. So when you go to another place where you don't have an infrastructure, either you have to build your infrastructure, or you should have different ways of communications. And in this case, the soldiers didn't have the equipment. So more and more evidence was emerging that the Russian forces rely on civilian radios and mobile phones for their communications. So this is a picture that claims that captured by Ukrainians. So there are also many recorded radio communication in Russian. So we believe that these claims are correct. Okay, so if you don't have the infrastructure there, if you don't have time to build there, so you have to use something else. So instead of using analog radio, actually the close thing that comes into mind is to use satellites, right? So in this kind of military operations, actually you can use satellites. So here's a picture from Iridium Next project. So we have low Earth orbit satellites, actually thousands of them, rotating around the world. So there's a picture of it. So these dots actually represent satellites, and these circles actually represent the area these satellites can reach. So for instance, if you're on a ship lost in the ocean here, and if you have a proper device, you can communicate with the satellite, and that satellite actually transmits it to next satellites until there's a landline communication. Okay. So this way, actually, as you can see, this circles covers the whole Earth. I think around 70 satellites is enough for that. But don't forget that these are low Earth orbit satellites. So this dot actually don't stay there. Actually, it is, rotating around the world. So all of these satellites are rotating. And, to have backups, you have actually more than 70 satellites, probably 15 of them are backup, so that if something happens to one of the satellites, they take control, they take its position, and so on. So actually, we humans covered the whole Earth with satellites, so you can actually communicate if you have the proper device from anywhere on Earth to anywhere on Earth. So this was initially started as an Iridium project funded by Motorola, but then there were some, I think due to the funding, it stopped, and then restarted as the Iridium Next. And this time, I think the satellites were built by Thales and sent by SpaceX. So these are the news from those times. So as you can see, it started in 2016. So in batches of, they sent satellites. So this is from 2017. SpaceX launches first batch of Iridium Next satellites. And this is from, again, June 2017, second launch. So in this case, 10 Iridium satellites are sent. Again, at the end of 2017, third set of Iridium Next satellites are sent. Again, the fourth one is just the end of 2017. And again, in beginning of 2018, the fifth batch is sent. And finally, in 2019, the project is completed. So this is a historic event, actually. Since 2019, we have all of those satellites that covers the whole Earth. So in military operations, you can use these satellites, or if you're for instance, mountaineer, if you are in a tight spot, if you have the proper device, you can just send text or audio and with your coordinates and ask to be rescued. So this could be one of the solutions. But of course, these are not for internet to use high bandwidth internet communications. For that, we have a different solution, and that is called Starlink, which I'm going to talk next. So let's briefly summarize what we have told. The Iridium satellite constellation provides L-band voice and data information coverage to satellite phones, pagers, and integrated transceivers over the entire surface of Earth. So you either need a satellite phone, or if you're a mountaineer, you have a proper device, transceivers that you can use it. So satellites are in low Earth orbit at a height of approximately 781 kilometers. Iridium is designed to support extremely small, low bandwidth devices that are easily battery powered. So that is the good thing. So this is how it differs from Starlink, because Starlink actually provides high bandwidth. Okay. So let's move on to that. So again, this is from last year during the war. At February 28th, Elon Musk sent Starlinks to not to soldiers, but civilians in Ukraine. So they had access to internet, because when you lose the infrastructure, you lose your internet. So this way, with the Starlink transceivers, they had the internet. So it is actually something simple. You have a satellite dish here. So this way, it is directly communicating with a satellite. So you don't need a landline or anything. And good thing is that you don't need a special device to use these dishes, because it is like a Wi-Fi router at your home. So you can just connect to it with your mobile phone or a laptop and directly use it directly connecting to satellite. So Starlink is a satellite internet constellation operated by SpaceX, providing satellite internet access coverage to most of the Earth. Users connect to terminals. This is what I'm talking about as the satellite dish. Terminals should see the sky. This is important. You cannot use it indoors. It has to be in the open air or at the roof of your building. So this is actually this technology is for those people who have a home at maybe in the mountains and so on. You don't have the infrastructure to connect internet, but it's just using the satellite dish, you have a fast internet. The terminals communicate with the closest satellite. Satellite communicates with the closest ground station. So in the case of Ukraine, this was, I think, Poland. Latency is around 20 to 40 milliseconds. This is really good. And users in Ukraine reported around 200 megabits per second internet connection. So this is really good speed actually having by using satellite. So don't forget that Starlink satellites also low Earth orbit satellites, so they rotate around the world. So your dish actually should see the satellite, but it is moving. So it is designed so that the satellite also, rotates a little bit so that it has a good connection. But when the satellite is out of view, the dish rotates itself and connects to another satellite. So at this point, you have some kind of latency, which is, if you're using internet for regular purposes, you wouldn't notice. But if you're playing an online video game, you would notice it. But it is a very nice technology. Since this is network security, let me also talk a little bit about security. In 2022, Leonard Waters from Catholic University of Leuven showed that Starlink user terminals, which are satellite dishes, are vulnerable to fault injection attacks. These are side-channel attacks, so you need to have a physical access to the satellite dish. So with a $25 homemade hacking tool, the attacker actually can have access to locked parts of the Starlink system. So Starlink provided a firmware update which makes the attack harder, but not impossible, because once there is a problem with the hardware, it is hard to solve it with software measures. So in the future versions, most probably they will provide a different hardware to solve this problem. So hacking tool is available here, and you can reach Walter's presentation from here. There's a very nice Wired article about it, and Starlink actually provided a 6-page security explanation. So actually, the bug is was not easy to capture. Actually, it is a very, very good attack by Walters. So, but I'm saying this because if you obtain Starlink, then you should put the dish in a place so that the attacker cannot have physical access. This is important because during the war or during the earthquakes, you have to put it on a public place, so you have to also secure it physically. All right, so this actually leads us to the earthquake. So we had a very bad last month, and it still actually continues. So we had 2 earthquakes starting with February 6th. So people thought that maybe Elon Musk can also send Starlinks to Turkey. And actually, Elon Musk tweeted saying that Starlink is not approved by Turkish government yet. SpaceX can send as soon as approved. And actually, they never received the approval, so they never sent Starlink, as far as I know, until now. So let's explain why it would be nice to have Starlinks. So according to Bloomberg, a senior official said that thanks for the Starlink offer, Turksat has enough satellite capacity. So this actually doesn't make sense. Turksat and Starlink are actually 2 different technologies. Let me explain as follows. So actually, this is not a proper reason to reject the offer. So there are currently more than 3,000 Starlink satellites operational on the sky. And Starlink uses low Earth orbit satellites. So their distance are between 340 kilometers to 1,200 kilometers. And of course, this is actually the expected space they want to cover. As far as I know, there isn't any Starlink satellite as close to Earth as this one. I think the closest are 570 kilometers away. But Starlink's actually planning to deploy more. So nearly 12,000 Starlink satellites were planned to be deployed and in the following years, and it can be possibly extended to 42,000. But Turksat satellites are geostationary. This means that their distance to Earth is something very specific, as specified here, 35,786 kilometers. This is important because if you send the satellite at that distance, actually it stays there and rotates with the same speed with the Earth. So if you, for instance, want to look at Turkey, you send it to this position, and since it rotates with the Earth, it always, it always stays at the top of Turkey. So, and there are, as far as I know, only 4 or 5 Turksat satellites that are operational. So these are 3A, 4A, 4B, and 5A and 5B. As far as I know, 5B is the last sent a few years ago, but I don't know if it is still operational. So it starts operating. So this is why I said 4 or 5. As you can see, this is some, I mean, these also can provide internet connection, but you need a special device for that. So people at the cities that suffered from the earthquake cannot use these satellites directly. So refusing the Starlink offer because of this actually doesn't make any sense. So let's talk about how we could use them. So if we had Starlink dishes, people might argue that this earthquake affected 10 cities. So regardless of how many dishes Elon Musk sends, actually you cannot provide internet communication to many of the places. But here, people forget that we lost communication to persons we sent to help for 3 or 4 days. We tried to call them, we sent WhatsApp messages, and they were unavailable for 3 or 4 days because they didn't have the internet connection or GSM communication. So if we had even only one single Starlink satellite at the city center of one of the destroyed cities, that would actually provide internet communication to just a 100 diameter circle. But people always forget that our mobile phones and laptops actually can be used to create an ad hoc network. So assume that you have a Starlink satellite that is 50 meters away from you. So you are using your phone to connect to internet via this Starlink. you can also turn your mobile phone as a hotspot. While using the Wi-Fi, you can also use your Wi-Fi to share this communication. So now you create another circle, for instance, maybe 100 meters of diameter. So this way, people can actually scatter around and actually can cover the whole city. So this way, you can even actually provide internet to people who are stuck in the collapsed buildings. So this is why it was very important to have this technology at the time of earthquake. Even the persons trying to help needed that communication, because we asked our friends what they needed, but they didn't even receive our messages. Okay, so there was a very big problem. And if we had this kind of ad hoc network, people who are under the collapsed buildings and have their mobile phone next to them, they could connect to this Wi-Fi, and they could use the internet, do WhatsApp calls, whatever. So they could easily say that they're actually alive and they can tell their position. This is important because without this kind of communication, what we do is to shout if there's anybody in the collapsed building. Actually, they shout back, but since there's huge rubble, actually we cannot hear them. This is why it is important to have this kind of solution. So 5 years ago, when I was teaching this course, I suggested students to create an app that allows this kind of ad hoc networks that we can use during the infrastructure failures like earthquakes. Unfortunately, 5 years later, this happened, and we didn't have that technology, which was actually just a simple piece of programming. We could easily do that. We could also communicate with people via Bluetooth, but Bluetooth in the open space, you have like 100-meter reception distance, but walls actually limited. And inside, if you're inside the collapsed building, and if you're at the very bottom, there's a chance that your Bluetooth signals might not reach to the top, but still trying to communicate with people via Bluetooth was another option, and that should be actually considered. Okay, so that was about internet communication. Let me talk a little bit about GSM communication and why we lost the GSM communication. So this earthquake affected 11 or 10 cities, and there were around 9,000 base stations there, and almost 1/3 of them were damaged during the Kahramanmaraş earthquake. So this is actually not surprising, because most of the time we are building these base stations on top of apartment buildings. So when the apartment collapses, also the base station collapses. So other option is to put on the top of a pole where it should be 8 meters distant from the people. And this is why it is when building new cities, people should consider building base stations not on top of the buildings, but maybe on open places like parks and so on, but 8 or 10 meters distant from people. So after the earthquake, not all of them are collapsed. More than 750 were repaired a few days later. And after the earthquake, around 190 mobile base stations were sent by the GSM companies, but of course, since considering the number of destroyed base stations, these weren't enough. This is why we didn't have communication. So we needed more than 1,000, but we only had a few hundred mobile stations. And actually, we don't know how or when they reached the place, because if they're, for instance, at the time of the earthquake, if they're in Istanbul, it takes like 10 hours of travel from Istanbul to those affected cities. So we should have a better strategy for this kind of situations. So actually, there's a lawsuit going on between Turkey and the GSM GSM companies. So we will see how this goes. So people argued that this is bad, of course. So one reason was that lack of investment. The lack of investment can be seen as follows. Some of the base stations in Turkey are still using 3G or even 2G. And in 2G, we can in real time listen to any GSM communication. So there isn't any security here, but for the case of earthquake, we are not interested in the confidentiality or security, but here we are interested because these are very old technologies. Even a small earthquake, if it doesn't even, collapse the building, can damage these base stations. This is why we lost also communication. So this lack of investment should be reconsidered. And because, we are talking about 5G or 6G and so on, but we only have this kind of, 4.5G in the city centers of big cities. Then another thing that was argued was as follows. It was the infrastructure, because since 2005 for the internet, only Türk Telekom is responsible for the infrastructure until 2026. So some argued that if some companies were allowed to invest in infrastructure, more fiber optic cables would leave cities and not all of them would be affected by the earthquakes at the same time. So this argument actually makes sense if it is done properly, because if only one company, have fiber optic cables, for instance, if all cables are leaving outside, then most probably since it is done by the same company, they should be together most of the time. So if an earthquake affects these cables, they affect all of them because they're close to each other. So if other companies invest, but not use other Türk Telekom's infrastructure, so use this, put these cables in a very different position, then you increase your chances that, during the earthquake, the probability would be low, so that, the probability of damaging all of the fiber optic cables that are located in different places will be low. So finally, some people said that maybe we could do it by drones, because there was a GSM company which had commercials saying that they can, provide GSM communication to any place via drones. But for this earthquake, actually, this was not practical, because, drones have very limited area coverage and there were bad weather conditions. You cannot fly drones for days. You have only a few hours of battery for them. So this was not even an option. So I think that would be all for me to say. So, we want to wish that this doesn't happen again, but science says that more earthquakes are on the way. And especially for the case of Istanbul, if it happens soon, the damage will be even more than this one. So we are just hoping that for the next time, we will be prepared and we have enough time to get prepared. Okay. Thank you for listening.